Harlan on reading critically, fiction as an information source, and some of you may know Marianne all the way back to when I knew her when she had brown hair and she was chair of the Governmental Relations Committee. But she said, don't even waste the time, so she's now with San Jose State and is going to share her vast knowledge with us.
Okay, we're streaming, so are you guys ready? Are we good? Okay, thank you. I think you'll find, and those of you who know me or may have had me as an instructor, and there are a few of you in this room, know that I can be a little contrary at times, so you might find some contrary opinions based on data in this report. But let's get started. I have, unfortunately, my notes on my phone, which is going to be interesting, I'm just going to say. So, you know, in 1990, Radine Bishop Sims Bishop wrote that amazing Windows, reading as Windows mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. If you haven't actually read it, it's like 2 pages. Take the time to read it. And one of the things she said is that literature transforms the human experience and reflects it back to us. She went on to say that it could help us understand each other better by helping change our attitudes towards difference. And she's used this metaphor of windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And it kind of went away. And then in 2014, it gained a lot more attention because Walter Dean Myers wrote a op-ed for the New York Times, which if you want to reach a lot of people, the New York Times is a good way to do it. And he wrote an op-ed about reading and representation and how little representation there is of marginalized minority voices in the United States. And it's pretty bad. And it hasn't gotten much better. We know that. It's getting a little better, but not much. Anyways. And his son, Christopher, actually added to the metaphor in another op-ed in the same edition of the New York Times when he talked about journeys and maps and how books could do that for you. Coming out of that in 2014, you had 2 very important movements that have made a difference in the publishing world. Although, frankly, what's happening right very now, it makes it hard to believe that it made a difference in the publishing world. And that is the We Need Diverse Books movement, which is actually really children's and YA oriented, but also Own Voices, which is throughout the publishing world and has showed up in a lot of genres and a lot of different audiences. Clearly, we need some work on that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google American Dirt. You'll hear a little bit about it. So it's this idea, right? That like if we give kids books to read that reflect themselves or that they can learn others, that they can learn about the world and that they can engage in it and that they can, as Freire said, read the world. But I gotta say, I was looking around and I wasn't seeing that so much. And so I wanted to see what that really meant. And I'm gonna address race and my participants a little bit later on in this. I actually saw this as an information literacy issue, right? Because the 1989 definition of information literacy was that information literate people have learned how to learn. And so if we're gonna read fiction and learn about and find something out about the world, we're learning, right? Like, so this is an information literacy, therefore it is a library issue. And it's an information literacy issue, which is one of the contrary things that I'm gonna have to say is that I'm a little disappointed in the way the common beliefs went from the AASL learning standards because they focus on academic reading, and that's not the same thing as reading fiction and learning about the world. So I was a little disappointed in that, I have to say. But there is this idea that learners engage with relevant information resources and digital learning opportunities in a culture of reading. Like that's part of the common belief. And it's there, and so we want to, what does that look like? For the English teachers among us, right? one of the things that's happened is we have this idea that there's reading for information and there's reading for pleasure, and never the twain shall meet, right? Like they're two different things. So this actually comes out of reader response theory and reader experience research from Louise Rosenblatt. It's ancient, also should be revisited. And Rosenblatt herself is like, yeah, y'all got it wrong, let me tell you. But basically what she's come up with is two different types of reading, right? Efferent reading, which is I'm reading for information, and aesthetic reading. And I'm gonna try and pull that note because I think it's helpful in this. I thought I had it quoted, but I don't. But aesthetic reading is not just reading for pleasure, but for reading for the story, how the words come together and what it tells you and what the experience of reading is. That's what she claims. It's what the experience of reading is, and that's aesthetic reading. So the way this gets interpreted in school and the way this gets interpreted in Common Core is that these are two separate things. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna teach our kids efferent reading, and we're only gonna teach them to read for information. And we're gonna define information so narrowly, right? It's what comes out of the textbook. Or if you're, doing like a literature book that's a whole class read, it's like, what's the theme? And yes, there is a specific theme, and it's what the teacher says it is. And so this is this type of reading for information that kids are really experiencing, and we're not really getting away into how to get them to read for the experience of reading, for how the words come together, what it tells you about themselves, what it tells you about the world. And that came out really clear. But as I was kind of going into this, I was looking at the differences between can you read aesthetically for information? So how do those two things? And again, I want to mention the fact that Rosenblatt would say yes, right? We oversimplify her tremendously, and she has some problems with that. She's written about it. So here's the thing. Do teens read fiction for information? Do they pick up a book and say, I'm going to learn about myself, or I'm going to learn about the world around me? Somebody beat me to it. Not quite that simple, but so this is kind of getting into the idea of reading as a mirror, reading as a window, and reading as a sliding glass door. And I wanted confirmation about that. So there are some people who would say, yes, absolutely, they do. Mahan, who wrote a book called Girls Reading, would say, absolutely, they can experience fiction as an aesthetic experience while learning something about the world around them. And Jeffrey Wilhelm, who wrote You Gotta Be the Book, and it's in its 3rd edition, will tell you the same thing, right? He would say, absolutely. Of course, he wrote a book for the 3rd time telling you how to get them to do that. So there's some points to be made there. But there's also some challenges to assumptions. And this is something that I thought was true before I started this project. So confirmation bias here, absolutely. But Suzanne Keene did a whole research study on how reading builds empathy. And what she found was essentially that when you're reading for empathy, you're reading in your own self-interest. You pick something up and you read it because you know you're going to have empathy with that character. It's very unusual for a reader to pick something up and read it outside of their self-interest. And so, of course, especially if it's self-reading, then you reading for empathy, it's questionable whether it does build empathy or you already had that empathy to start out with, and it just confirms what you thought. She did this with adults. I'm gonna say, I did a similar presentation. I had a question like, isn't this just adolescents? Because they're so self-interested. She did this with adults. So this is something that is true of people, not just like, oh, those self-interested teenagers over there. Because, most people are self-interested. Lisa Sunshine did a thing, and she said, reading can give us into different states of mind, but that doesn't necessarily, what's happening cognitively hasn't been sussed out yet. We don't really know. It can take you somewhere. You can walk through the sliding glass door, but we don't really know how that works to build empathy or anything like that. So starting to ask that question, I had some things to stand on because you have different ideas. And then to go back to the teenagers, Marsha Blackford did a thing with girls. I do a lot of work on girlhood. I'll talk about that tomorrow. But when she went back, the girls there were like, yeah, I read, but it's just not real life. Like, it's just entertainment. And so that reading is not real life, I thought was a really interesting finding, because I don't think as librarians we think about that. I think we're like, oh, let's get them to read because it'll tell them something about their world and themselves, and it'll build empathy, and it'll turn them into activists. And yeah, maybe, maybe not. So I went out and asked the kids, because, you know, that's how you find out. You go out and ask them. They were juniors. They were a class. And this is really important because I asked them as a class. Like, the survey that I did was part of their class. And then when I interviewed them, it was on their school site. And so I was the strange adult who they kind of maybe knew because their older siblings sort of knew who I was, or my husband was on that campus. But like, really, I was the strange adult that was like showing up, and it seemed like schoolwork. And so I point that out because I think some of their responses to me, especially in the survey, was really like, they were answering school questions. They weren't like answering questions. And those seem to be two different things. It's rural. Yeah. Not currently. Yeah, I didn't post them. It's rural. I call it the Great White North, although that's not entirely accurate. But I'll give you an example of why that matters. So I used to live in Humboldt County. It's on the ocean. It's right there. We drove past it every day on the way to work. But one of the students in this class, when asked what his goal was, like one thing he really wanted, he wanted to see the ocean. So the rural part of it mattered. This part mattered themselves. They've never had to force themselves into somebody else's viewpoint in the ways that students of color have to do that every single day, that we put a textbook or a children's book or we do story time or whatever. Like, there's so little representation that they've learned how to make those jumps. Jessamine Ward writes a great piece about what it was like to identify with The Great Gatsby and why she did identify with Gatsby. And it seems like the most crazy thing, right? Black woman growing up in Mississippi identifying with Jay Gatsby, how does that work? But like, that's always been something she's had to do. So I think these kids haven't had this for as much of that necessary, and you're gonna see that when I talk about the athletes. So I do think that race mattered in this way, and it's hard to determine exactly how much. So first off, there's a real difference between readers and non-readers in the ways they talk about what they learn when they read. Readers seem to do it naturally, although even then, if you say, do you read fiction as an information source, they'll tell you no. You have to kind of dig a little bit deeper there. But none of the students said, I read fiction and I learned something from it. None of them said that. I asked really broadly. I didn't say, hey, is fiction an information source? Because clearly they're gonna say, what the hell are you talking about? So I asked really broadly, but all of them said, no, I don't read to learn anything. Like, I don't read fiction to learn anything. No, I don't do that. But the readers, and I did this, I could tell who were the readers and who were not the readers. The readers read at home. They read things outside of school. They actually read in class. I did a lot of observing, and you could tell the non-readers, they spent as much time trying to figure out how to avoid reading by like looking up summaries of their texts than they did actually reading. I was like, you just read that, and it'll take less time, but they really, the non-readers, you could tell very easily. But what would happen is the readers themselves would identify critical elements. So no one deserves not to have a choice. That person who said, I learned that no one deserves not to have a choice in the world, is also the person who's like, yeah, no, I didn't learn anything. And I'm like, well, wait, you have some conflicting information here. So a little bit it was about how the question was asked and where you were going with it. So the readers, they would pick up on those things and they would talk about them. This was a class that hated their mothers. They had mother issues. So like a couple of different people talked about like how they related to the characters and learned something from the way the characters interacted with their mother, because their mother reminded them of them, because that mother was such a mess. And she was like, you know, so one of the books was White Oleander. That led to a lot of the conversations about why we don't like our mothers, but it was pretty interesting. The non-readers only read for plot. They don't read for anything else. They read for what happens, and they're less likely to make connections to what is happening in the book to what is happening in the world around them. They're just not there. They didn't engage the text critically at all. And if they saw themselves reflected in it in a negative way, they were hostile. I don't know if I'm going to talk about that here or later, but I will definitely go back to the hostility to text, because it was interesting. Yeah, I'll talk about it here. So the primary way that they were getting information when they were reading was identity management, the mirror. So they read in ways in which they related to the characters, primarily. So like, I would do what that character did, or I wouldn't do what that character did, or I understand how that character feels, and that tells me something about myself as a person. So there was a lot of that. They, in the sense that they read it as a window, they judged characters' actions against their own or choices that they might have made, right? So another way of defining themselves. So one of the reasons why I think race mattered. Story and quotes. So I hope you're not totally offended by bad language because it's a quote. But the girl comes in, white girl comes in with The Hate You Give in her hands, and she's like, I binge read the fuck out of this book. And I was like, good, we like that. So let's talk about it. Tell me about it. What, you know? And she gets into it. She starts talking about Star and the masks that Star has to put on when she moves between schools. And I'm like, well, why do you think she had to do that? Like, the teacher and I are standing there, and we're like, well, why does she have to do that? And she's like, I don't know. I mean, like, I have to do that all the time, like, with my friends, like, when I'm moving between my peer groups, and I'm like, oh, you missed the point. So that's why I said I thought race mattered in the ways that we talked about identity management and mirror reading, because I think they had not enough criticality to read text and be like, well, actually, I just don't have enough background knowledge to, like, understand what it means to be a black girl going to a white school. And essentially what ends up happening is that particular reader, the more we kind of followed up on that, was that she positioned herself as the white friend that the school, you know, that, like, basically at the end you're like, and they get in a fight. Yeah, there's reasons for that. So it was really, really about how they see themselves. The teacher and I talked a lot about the funhouse mirror. The majority of the kids in this class were working poor. Their families did not have enough money to keep food on the table, the lights on, and the rent at the end of the month. This was consistent in their lives. They had moved, they'd been evicted, they had times of homelessness. This was a majority of these kids, right? You ask them, they are solidly middle class. They don't have any concept. So the teacher, when she was teaching Huck Fun, did a privilege backpack. Do you guys know this thing? It's an exercise in figuring out what privileges that you have in your life. And when they got to the class issues, they were like, wait, it's a privilege to, like, have like, parents that don't worry about paying the rent? And we were like, Oh dear. So we talked a lot about how the Mirror was funhouse, especially around class issues, because they didn't really have a good sense of how class works in America and where they fit within that. And so I think sometimes that sort of kind of played out a little bit in the ways we talked about characters and what was happening, and even when you dug in a little bit more. When they had that sense, like so a lot of the stories, like the story about The Hate U Give happened before The Privilege Backpack, and that matters. I'll talk a little bit about what happened when they read socially and how it played a difference, and you can see the change a little bit. They basically were identifying with actions of characters. So they wouldn't necessarily pay attention to demographics. They'd think about things like that character, well, other than the masks, right? I get that, but that character plays a sport and I play a sport, so I must be like that character. Like very, very simplified things. Non-readers. Fascinating little thing happened around this. How many of you are familiar with the book Whale Talk? Okay, so it's Chris Crutcher, it's oldish. The main thrust of the story is that a young man wears his older brother's leather jacket to school, and the football players take exception with this because he didn't quote unquote earn it. And so the hero, probably a stand-in for Crutcher, decides to help this kid earn his leather jacket through swimming. And if you know anything about swimming, it's really easy to drop time when you first start doing it. And so the kid's able to earn a leather jacket. The point about this is the jerks in the book are the football players. So who wants to read the book? It's about athletes. I'm going to read the book, the football players in the class, who, frankly, I pegged as being the jerks when they walked in. But they were openly hostile to this book. And what happened is, if the only way you identify with a character is that character plays football and so do I, but wait a minute, that makes me really uncomfortable because that character is kind of an asshole. What does that say about me? We're not going there. So we're just openly hostile to the book. Like, it was fascinating to watch, and because I saw it coming a mile away, I was like, to the teacher, I was like, they're going to hate that book. I can tell, I know. And she's like, they wanted to read it. And I just sat there and I was like, and they hated it. So what happens is, think about that mirror. If you're not going to be open to it, how effective is it? And if you don't have enough understanding of yourself or the world around you, how effective is it? So the funhouse mirror, right? The distortions, the ways that we look as things. There definitely was, early on, fiction's not real. I can't get anything out of this. It's not real. It's not the real world. I had a really interesting Twitter conversation with another researcher who works on girls and fantasy and feminism this morning. And she was like, she's a YA researcher, and she was like, I'm trying to listen to contemporary YA, and it's too melodramatic, and it's driving me crazy. And then she told me she was listening to Dear Evan Hansen, and I was like, well, what do you think is going to happen? The book, not the musical. I was like, yeah. But anyways, we were talking about how sometimes fiction does distort the experience of being a teen, or distorts anybody's experience, and that's because you need conflict, or it's boring. But once you create conflict, it can get really intense, and it can be melodramatic, right? And so kids pick up on that. They're like, it's not real. So it's like, nobody responds like that. Like, who talks that way? John Green. And, oh, sorry. So, and then the other thing is I saw no evidence at all that they were like, wow, I'm reading about something different. I'm learning something, and I'm much more open to that. Like, I saw no evidence at all, even in the interviews, of empathy. Like, it was. And this is where somebody was like, well, isn't that just teenagers? And I was like, I think it's just people, but whatever. Where it was really just, it's all about me. Like, this is my experience with it, which makes that the distortion of the mirror even more interesting. So. So it's important. I think the point of this is that we can't just say, let's put the books in a kid's hands. It's like teaching. You can't just, or project-based learning, you don't just roll out the balls. It doesn't work that way. So you have to think about it in the ways that you can build critical readers. And I recognize that this can be a lot more difficult to do in the library. Although you can do it one-on-one, you can do it in book clubs, you can do it in collaboration with an English teacher if you have that opportunity, but it is, I think what's the most important takeaway is that you just don't roll out the balls. You don't put the diverse books in front of the white kids and think that they're gonna get something out of it. You are questioning of the representations that you put in front of the other kids, right? Like in front of kids, students of color or queer students. Like, what is the representation here really saying? I'll talk about that a lot tomorrow. So one thing that I think is really important, and this is a drum I have been banging since 2012 when I finished my dissertation, which is you have to define information beyond school. When you ask kids about information, they think about it as discrete and specific and generally textually related unless it's coming from the teacher, right? They don't think about it as experience. And they definitely didn't think about it as emotion. But when I sat down and had interviews with the kids, and I was like, how did the book make you feel? And then they'd answer, and then I'd say, so what do you know about yourself from that feeling? Or what do you know about others from that feeling? They could answer that question. But they were like, I had one student stop me and say, wait, is that information? And I was like, well, what do you think? And so we had a conversation about information. And if information is anything that's informing, right? It's what we feel, it's what we see, it's what we hear, it's what we can, it's anything that we can take in, anything that's informing, then that shifts the way we talk about if you could read a book and learn something from it, even if it's, The Hate U Give, right? So, and how does that happen and how does that work? But if we're only talking to kids about information as something that's discrete, factual, and discernible, then it's very, very difficult to step beyond reading is not the real world. So I've been beating that particular thing for a very long time, and I will continue to. Readers, you have to give them context, right? They have to know about the world around them. It can't be a 2-mile square circle and that's it. You have to step out and see what's happening. This year, that teacher is doing a Skype project with a group of kids in New Jersey, urban New Jersey, and the experience that they're having, just having a conversation about what their world and their schools are like. It's opened everything up to them. And they're having a very different experience. They're having different experience with reading. And I don't know how much that contributes to it, but it's definitely there. So once you started, once there was a lot of conversation about context, about class and race and institutional structures and how they work in the United States, and then the kids were able to read, they shifted a little bit in how they understood what fiction was doing. They were highly, highly critical of the ending of Huckleberry Finn, right up until everybody told them you read Huckleberry Finn to learn about the past. And then they were like, okay, that's why we read it. Yeah, that's a problem. That's a real problem because of the way slavery is and is not represented in Huckleberry Finn. It doesn't tell us much about the past. Not without a lot of context. And so they need to be questioned, right? They need to, the girl from The Hate U Give, what did you like about the book? Well, how did you relate to Star? And when she went on that space, and we were like, yeah, but do you think it mattered that she was one of the only black girls in the school? Oh, well, yeah, I could kind of see that. But they need to be questioned. That sort of needs to go a little bit further within that. You can't just hand them. You can't just hand the book. And they need to be engaged in dialogue. And this is the White Oleander story. So early in the year, when I did the survey, I had three students out of 27 or so say, I don't like my mom. She's a drunk. She's an addict. She's this. She's that, you know. And it showed up in their surveys because they were talking about the characters in the books and how they had problems with their mom. So fast forward, they did book groups. And one group was reading Oleander. And two of them were adamant that the main character should ditch mom, just like go into foster care, like just whatever, you know. And the other two were like, stop. That's not how it works. She's her mom. And then went on to talk about being in foster care and what that's like and what the structures of foster care mean and how difficult it was. And they were able to do that because they had been there. And so that was how empathy was created. Not because they read the book, but because the book opened up a conversation about what it was like to be in foster care. And that changed everything, so reading has to be something that's social. There has to be dialogue around it. Like I read, here's a good one. I read and loved Eleanor and Park. Read and loved it. I have seen some very critical takes on Park's character and the multiple problems with it. And if I don't have that conversation, I don't see that. I don't recognize that. It doesn't pop out to me. And so having those conversations, those matter to readers. And you can, frankly, eventually you can get it where it's, oh wow, I just had a flash. You can get it where it's fun, right? So when I was doing quick picks, ages ago, back when I was a site librarian, I'd get kids come in and they hated reading. But then they'd start reading and they'd always want to come in and talk about their book that they read, which was great for me because I needed to know what they thought about it. But like, that was fun. They started to have fun reading. And I don't know that it was as much about the reading as it was about telling me about how much fun it was, how great this book was. Or their friend, oh my God, you have to read this book. It was so amazing. So we need to start engaging them in dialogue. That has to happen. Then you don't need that part. And then we need to, oh man, this is preaching to the choir. We need to rework reading programs. Yeah, I knew that was coming. The assessment, seriously. My students know, I tell you guys this all the time when we talk about AR, among other things, that like, I get it. If you're a teacher, you have obligation to show that your students are doing something, right? Like, everybody's on you to be like, well, what are they doing? And how can you show it? And give me the data. Sorry, I loved your data. Give me the data, right? Like, everybody wants that, and I recognize that. But seriously, folks, you take it away, they read more. Like, why can't we pay attention to the research on this? I do not understand. So the teacher this year reworked her reading program. No assessment, like none. The other thing that she did, I mean, she has assessment, she has a reading assessment and the other pieces of like the things that they do in her English class, but not for like independent reading. Like, just no. The other thing that we do, I've been telling her for 12 years to stop with the like to value it in class. Like, give time to read in class. Swear to God. She tells me the other night on the phone, she's like, yeah, they're reading. It's so great this year. Because, like, I just stop the, like, 10-minute thing, and I just give them a long section, and we read in class, and I don't expect homework. And they were reading. And I'm like, I'm glad that after 12 years of really good friendship, you finally got there. Because I swear, I've been telling her that for 12 years. But so that has really changed the way that they're reading, but it also has changed the way they talk about their books. And because discussion and dialogue matter, it's starting to kind of change the ways things are happening. And so she can have conversations them that sort of open up much more critical approaches to reading. And so they are starting to see it a little bit more as like, oh, I can learn something about the world in doing this. The other thing, and this was never a problem with that particular teacher, but choice, right? Let them read what they want to read, please, for crimey's sake. Some dead horses that I continue to beat because it just feels like they have to be. So reading is social. We have to see it as that. We have to build trust. I'm standing up here and talking about things that are difficult to talk about, and tomorrow's worse. Race, class, gender, sexual identity. Those things are really hard to talk about. They're harder to talk about in public schools. And I get it wrong all the freaking time. Just happens. And so it's hard to do that if you don't have trust with the students that you have coming through. And when you have 3,000 kids in your school and you're the only school librarian, I know, right? How on earth are you going to do that? That's where I think like book clubs and those types of things can come in. Ways to figure out what their names are. Like that kind of stuff just matters. So building trust, you have to shift awareness. We need to be anti-racist teachers. Flat out. We need to do that. That's what our children deserve. And part of that is shifting awareness. And so, but if you shift awareness, then that makes things like the window and the map and the sliding glass door available to people. And it's not shoving people of color through a very narrow window that they've been shoved through their entire life. So we really need to, if you guys don't know it, #DisruptText. We have to disrupt the curriculum. We have to disrupt the books because that's what's going to take to kind of get and build critical readers in a way that makes reading a really good information source for the world around us. We have to ask questions. One of my favorite stories, God, I miss them so much. I'm sitting, and this goes back, it's gonna date me, I understand, but I'm not in schools anymore, so it's hard. I'm sitting in the library and I'm working away at something and the class is coming in and they're getting ready to go and these 5 girls are in a vicious discussion, Edward versus Jacob. And I'm like sitting over there and I look up and I'm like, they both need to dump her ass because she's a problem. And they were like, Miss Harlan. And they had to wait. But then we had to have a good conversation about all the ways that Bella is totally anti-feminist and is a really big problem. Right? I told you I was going to date myself. But we have to ask questions. We have to get in there. Like with the kid, what did you really like about this book? Well, why do you think that happened for her? Those types of things. Those are important. So even if because I miss this, I have a tendency to intervene in Barnes and Noble. But yeah, I do that too. I'm that adult. Even if you have an opportunity in an overheard conversation in your library to kind of enter into that question to push the ways that they can read critically, then they can start seeing fiction as an information source. But it has to. That's what it's going to take. Which is why Wilhelm has written 3 books, and the last one's like 300 pages. Telling you how to do it. So the bottom line is it doesn't come naturally. It did for the readers because they had a lot of practice. They didn't see fiction as an information source. They weren't like, oh yeah, I'm learning something from this, right? But they had a lot of practice in how to do it because they read. So, but we have to just not assume that it's going to come naturally because it's not. You have to work at it. You have to work with them. And you have to listen to them too. I mean, it's amazing what happens when you start listening. So that would be the bottom line that I would think on the takeaway. So stop. This is a pet peeve. Stop being like, I've built a diverse collection and I'm done. Yeah, no, you're not. It's going to take more. It's going to take a lot more. And also be conscious and critical of the reflections of the representations in that diverse collection. Look for own voices. Because if you don't know what I'm talking about, Google American Dirt and you can see the problem. We don't need representation after representation after representation of trauma porn. We need something else. We need something that's complex and looks at the world differently. And so these things are, and I bring that up around own voices because it was promoted as own voices even though it clearly wasn't. But look for the own voices stuff because that's probably has better and more complex, more interesting representations. So, I'm done. Questions? Yes.
This is hard for me because I going through something right now. Thank you, Marianne. That was a wonderful presentation. I learned so much.
We'll talk later. Yeah, sorry. This isn't quite a safe space. Okay.
I don't really have this question exactly formed in my mouth, in my mind, sorry, but I think you can figure it out. So if students like to read with who they identify about, and you have students who don't necessarily want to read, but you want to give them other perspectives, how do you find a book for that boy that hates to read and doesn't want to read about somebody that's not just like him? Or girl.
Yeah. If you're dealing with a non-reader, reluctant reader, struggling reader, however we want to call it, you got to get them reading first. So, I mean, if you can give them something of different, like a book that's got a character in it that's not exactly like them, great. And they want to read it, if they can find a hook or a way into it. And, you know, kids are pretty good about finding ways into books. It's just, I'm not so sure it's obvious that they're getting out of it what we seem to think they're getting out of it. But when you're dealing with a non-reader, you got to get them reading first. And that, okay, other controversial statement and semi-opinion, some kids are never going to read. Some people are never going to read. It's just not going to happen. I know we have the right book, right reader mindset, and I think we have to have that mindset, but I also think we have to be realistic. For some people, there is no right book. They just don't read. So, but you got to get them reading first.
Thank you. I'm wondering if I should just stand here so I don't have to walk the microphone back. I was wearing my English teacher hat and remembering how I would ask students, can you make a connection, text to self, text to world, text to text? And so my wonder/hope is we need a fourth question or a fourth, I don't have a connection because I lack that experience or I lack that barrier. So I'm wondering, yes. So do you have a suggestion or is there another set of questions? Do you want to write that set of questions for us of how to facilitate those conversations with kids?
Somebody offered me a different population last night for this same study, so let me get back to you on that. I do think that, what didn't you understand? What didn't you know? What bored you? Right? What bored you about this text?
Because of this push for nonfiction, how do we, communicate that fiction can also be a source of information? And right now, you kind of killed me a little bit because right now building empathy was like where I was going to go. And we have gone there. So that was like our big thing that I think helped us. So
this is one study with a lot of kids. And like I said, man and Wilhelm will tell you differently that you can. I don't think they use it that way because I know that I do think you can connect fiction to social and emotional learning. And so that's probably the way to go into that. Vastly misunderstood and misinterpreted by people who want to shove nonfiction down people's throats. That's not what it says. It's not what it says. It's not what it says. Anyways, especially when you start recognizing the responsibilities of other subject areas in the reading instruction. Now, problems with that too, because they're not prepared to do reading instruction. So how, short-sighted, very short-sighted. So, but what I was thinking about this is go back to information literacy, go back to the information literacy standards with the idea that information is anything that helps us learn. And if we're reading something that's fiction, it doesn't mean you can still use fiction as an information source. It's just you have to teach them how to do it. You can't roll out the ball. I think that's the biggest point, is that you have to teach them how to do it, especially for non-readers. You can't just expect it to happen. And you do that through dialogue. You do that through context building. And you do that through practice. And those things have to happen. And so the argument can be, I am teaching how to read for information. I am. I'm just teaching it about how to read for the emotional information that teaches us something about our world. Information is emotion. What time is it? Okay.
So I'm wondering if you thought about how, because you've said several times, like, it's not just young adult readers, but just people reading. So have you thought about how this could help us with conversations with our faculty about diversifying core curriculum and core literature in their classes?
I haven't, but I do want to comment on something else. One thing, like Jen was saying, she put her English teacher hat on, and one thing is to get, so the readers came naturally because they had a lot of practice. I suspect somebody, probably a parent when they were taught how to read, or somewhere, somehow they picked up particular types of reading skills that allow them to sort of see, like, oh, here's this information here. But they're not going to stop and think about and break that apart. English teachers aren't either, right? They just are like, well, I read and I get this, because they were all readers. And so one thing is to get English teachers to stop and think about what it might be like to teach math, because that's what it's like for their non-readers when they're reading, right? It's like math language or something like that. So that's one thing. In terms of the other subject areas, because we need to disrupt text so much, I'm less likely to want to put fiction in their subject areas. I don't want history teachers teaching Huckleberry Finn like it's true, or that it teaches us something about our past. Yeah.
What I really was focusing on was the sort of when we read for empathy, is it that we're learning empathy by reading a book, or we're choosing books that match our empathy?
We are choosing books that, how can we get them to I would start with investigating sort of anti-racist teaching type strategies and pedagogies. Culturally responsive pedagogy, there's a great book out you can get a hold of. I mean, Stamped has just come out, right? We should probably all be really familiar with that, because this is, I think part of being able to do that is to unpack our own place in the world. I mean, what we saw from the kids is that before they unpacked their own place in the world, they couldn't read, they could only read very simply. Once they unpacked their place in the world a little bit, just a little bit, they were much more willing to listen to others about the book. So White Oleander, that conversation wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been after the unpacking had occurred, because the other girls would have shut it down. They would have been like, I'm not listening to this. And That's the other place where trust was built, because it was also towards the end of the year, so the kids were a lot more trustful of each other. But that's the thing. That's the building context place, right? So, since we all do it naturally, like, you have to build context when you're thinking about that for kids to unpack their position in the world. And some kids are forced to do it, others no. So. Okay, thank you. I'm doing this on girls, Saturday. Less about the kids, more about the books.